So we'll have more time for questions and discussion later. I realize there's a trade-off between these, so I'll try to control myself. But let me start by just defining what I'm going to talk about. I think there are three concepts in the very title of my book which need some clarification. There is political economy, there is occupation, and there's Israel. And all these three topics are not very straightforward. So just to clarify, political economy is a field of academic thought, of scholarly thought, that tries to incorporate different aspects of social thinking, of social sciences, with an eye towards economic understanding. But it should not be confused with the Department of Economics. And please don't expect neither the book nor my talk here to be one in economics with models and econometric regressions and that sort of thing. That's not what I do. The idea is that we try to understand political reality through understanding the material concerns, the material interests that help to form that reality. The second concept is the concept of the occupation. And it may not be as straightforward as some of you perhaps think. The occupation, when we talk about it, it's not just the occupation of that happened in the 1967 war when Israel occupied certain pieces of land. There are different people who refer to it in different ways. After all, there was a lot of occupation of Palestinian land that happened in 1948. And there was also occupations that happened later from Lebanon in the 80s as well. But most importantly, when we talk about the occupation, we cannot just confine ourselves to discuss the parts of Palestine under Israeli military rule, which means the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This is what I'm going to focus on, and I'm not going to talk about the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. But these two territories, the occupation spreads deep into every aspect of Israeli society. And I'm going to get back to that point later because I think it's a very important aspect of this whole endeavor to try to understand this special and unique historical phenomenon. And the third term is Israel. Israel seems to be quite straightforward. It's the name of a country. But when asked where is that country, the answer is not so straightforward. Israel has recently been admitted to become a member of the OECD, the Organization for Developed Economies. And the condition that was presented to Israel when they applied to join the OECD is that they only provide statistical data which refers to the territory which is the internationally recognized borders of Israel, which means not including the West Bank, of course not including East Jerusalem, and not including the Gaza Strip or the Syrian Golan Heights. And Israel simply ignored that request and decided to include in its territory all of the illegal settlements in the West Bank, the illegal colonies, and the population living there. So that's part of Israel, according to how Israel sees things. But the Palestinians were not included. They were somehow invisible and were not part of the statistics. The Palestinians living in these areas. And that's not the end of the complexity of that issue, because also you have a lot of borderline communities and populations which are perhaps some of them are occupied under international law, but they are treated differently from different occupied populations. For example, Palestinians in East Jerusalem are treated very differently than Palestinians in Gaza or Palestinians in Jenin. There is a very wide range of policies that Israel applies to different groups of people. And there are also the Bedouin communities that live in the Negev or the Nakab, the south of Israel. That's supposed to be part of Israel. And yet the Israeli government treats the Bedouin who live there as intruders, as if they are foreigners who are occupying Israeli land. and Israel is trying to ethnically cleanse this community. The most famous and most recent issue is the village of El Araqib, which has been demolished for 11 times by the Israeli forces, and the residents keep rebuilding their homes again and again. So these are just the terms, just to explain why it's not just black and white terms. Now, what I'm not going to talk about this evening, however, is the story of human suffering. There's not going to be a discussion of the atrocities committed by Israel, and not because they're not important, but because I think for anyone who's interested, I'll be more than happy to provide you with links for information. It's very easy to access the data. But the purpose of my talk here is not to evoke just an emotional response from you and to make you feel sorry for the Palestinian population, but to try to go through a kind of rational path to understand why things are the way they are. And that's because I believe that if you approach this issue through understanding, through rational thought, you also can come up with ideas for solutions and for what kind of action can actually change the situation, rather than just feeling sorry. And also, another reason for not going into the human suffering aspect is that it should actually come as no surprise that there is human suffering and atrocities committed in a situation of occupation. I mean, this is a military conflict, there is a colonization. These are not unique aspects. Let's try to focus on the unique aspects of Israeli occupation. And now I'm going to move on to talk about, and that's going to be the bulk of what I want to say, the three research questions that I came across in my work and led me to write this book. These are questions that I found very perplexing. I came across them during my political work, and I'll try to address these questions and offer perhaps a partial answer to them. I hope that will not discourage you from buying the book and reading it. But for those of you who won't, I hope that will also be at least a partial answer to the question, to these three questions. So the three questions are, first, what is the role of the international community, especially through aid, through money that is being spent on this area, territory, aid to the Palestinians, aid to Israel, and who is actually paying for the occupation? And of course, the follow-up question for that is why? Why is the international community spending so much money in that area? And my second question is, what about the cost of the occupation? Is the occupation actually profitable for Israel, for the occupiers? And since my answer is actually no, it's not profitable, and I'll explain why, the follow-up question is, in that case, why does Israel continue to occupy? Why doesn't Israel withdraw? There are plenty of opportunities to end the occupation and to sign a peace treaty, and Israel refuses to do that. And that brings me to the third and last question. Why is Palestine so important? Why are there so many people in this room, perhaps? It would be another way to ask the same question, and I will get to that. So let me start with the first question, the international community. I think it goes without saying that under international law, the occupier, which is responsible for the well-being of the occupied population. That has been accepted in the United Nations, in the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel is a signatory to that convention. So Israel is actually responsible for the well-being of Palestinian population under its control. Therefore, any aid to the occupied Palestinian population is actually aid to Israel. It's a gift to Israel. And that is something very straightforward and clear, which the international community was very aware of. And yet, as soon as the Oslo process began in 1992, the international community started to find ways to start aid even before the Palestinians had sovereignty, which they still don't. But this I think is a very interesting indication for especially the European Union made a decision, a strategic decision, which was also not kept secret in any way. They believe in a two-state solution. They believe in that a two-state solution is also in the interest of the European Union. And the way to achieve that is to try to create the economic foundations for an independent Palestinian state by sending aid. So aid starts as soon as there is a peace process, as soon as the Palestinian Authority has been created, and aid starts since 1994. But the aid is classified under two different ways. You can either have development aid or humanitarian aid. And obviously donors prefer development aid because they were trying to create employment and infrastructure for the Palestinians so that Palestinians will have a viable state, a sustainable state. That was their way of trying to end the violence and the conflict. But what we see in reality is that this development aid was actually a failure. Between 1994 and 1999, or 2000 actually, about $7 billion worth of of development aid alone were invested, and were not able to achieve any improvement in the standard of living of Palestinians in the occupied territories for a lot of reasons, mainly because the Israeli authorities prevented the projects from succeeding, mainly because Israeli authorities put numerous bureaucratic and other kinds of obstacles and kept raw materials from reaching their destination, kept workers from reaching their workplace. And when the second Intifada started in the year 2000, the donors reacted by shifting from development aid to humanitarian aid. This shift continues largely until today. There is more humanitarian aid than development aid. More food, medicine, emergency support, just to keep the population from a humanitarian catastrophe, and very little in the way of developing the Palestinian economy, because the development of the Palestinian economy is simply not working. And this happens to be also Israel's interest. This happens to be exactly what Israel wants, because the humanitarian aid takes responsibility off Israel's shoulders and also is a source of profit for Israeli companies. A lot of the food that is being bought, that is bought by the United Nations, by the World Food Program, by Oxfam, by the Red Cross, and shipped to Palestinians is bought from Israeli companies, because the customs situation that Israel has created with the occupied territories makes it cheaper and easier for the aid agencies to buy Israeli products than to import food, which is actually cheaper in Jordan and Egypt. But then if they import it from there, they have to pay customs to Israel, which is another source of profit for Israel. Therefore, they just buy from Israeli companies. They also have to use Israeli transportation companies, so that's another source of profit for Israel, and to pay various taxes. And most importantly, they use Israeli currency for everything. Palestinians don't have their own currency. Therefore, all of the transactions that aid agencies do, they do with Israeli currency. And then what you actually see is that the occupation became one of Israel's biggest exports. It's an export because Israeli companies provide services to international companies. The international companies pay with foreign currency, which is converted into Israeli currency. The foreign currency stays in the vaults of the Israeli central bank. The local currency is being used locally, and the Israeli companies profit. That works without creating any competition for the Israeli companies, because the Palestinian economy doesn't develop, because the development aid has been largely forsaken. And then there is this kind of myth that Palestinians are the highest recipients of aid per capita in the world. It's a myth that has been propagated by some Zionist organizations. But it's not true. They are amongst the highest, which still needs explanation, and I will get back to that. Why Palestinians receive more per capita aid, for example, than people in Darfur. You can do. I don't really believe that you can do a comparison of suffering. But you can do a comparison of mortality rates. The mortality is much higher in Darfur, and yet more aid flows to Palestine. But the Palestinians are not the top recipients of per capita aid in the world. The top recipient is Israel, and that brings me back to what you mentioned before, what Victoria said before about the U.S. aid from Israel, the U.S. military aid to Israel. $3 billion is actually not a peak number, it's the average number. And the dollar today is not the dollar that was 30 or 40 years ago when aid started. So actually it's less than it used to be. But there are other ways by which the U.S. also gives aid to Israel, for example, by giving guarantees to loans taken by Israel, which allows Israel to take loans at better interest because the U.S. signs the guarantee for these loans. So Israel is actually the biggest recipient of per capita aid in the world, at least when you look at long-term trends. If you look at just at the most recent years, Iraq had overtaken Israel for about 3 years between 2003 and 2006 because of the war. So that's one issue, which is that who pays for the occupation. Much of that cost falls on the burden on the shoulders of the international community. Much of that cost is paid by Europe, and on the other hand by the United States, which pays for the ammunition and guns that are used in order to repress Palestinian resistance. And that's a very interesting and difficult impasse, because the European Union so far has refused to adopt any kind of policy which puts sanctions on Israel or demands accountability from Israel. They're only willing to use carrots, but no sticks. And even though they're fully aware that all the aid that they're giving to the Palestinians actually ends up, not all of it, but a large part of it ends up in the hands of Israeli companies and the Israeli government, they continue to extend these projects year after year because they're not willing to take any kind of a punitive act and then stand against the United States and suffer the anger of the United States. Also, because the European Council has to take decisions by unanimous vote, there are certain countries in Europe, especially Germany, that would always veto any decision to take sanction against Israel. So that's the first question, and I don't think I've given you a full description of that, but I hope we can get back to that in the questions phase. The second issue is the cost of the occupation. Because according to what I said so far, you can get the impression that the occupation is profitable to Israel because the international community pays so much money. And so much of it ends up in the hands of the Israeli government and the Israeli companies. But actually, if we look at the first 20 years of occupation, more or less, the first 2 decades, the occupation was indeed profitable for Israel for a lot of reasons. The exploitation of cheap Palestinian workers, cheap Palestinian labor, the exploitation of Palestinian natural resources, especially agricultural land and water, and the exploitation of the captive Palestinian market, because Palestinians, if you go still today to a supermarket in the West Bank, you will see most of the products are in Hebrew. Most of the products are imported from Israel because Israeli companies have unlimited access, while importers find it much more difficult to bring products to the Palestinian markets. They have to pay customs and so on. And they have to go through checkpoints. And Palestinian producers themselves find it very difficult to produce under the limitations set by the Israeli government. So that creates an advantage for Israeli companies. So these are sources of profit. In fact, in the first years of the occupation, the Israeli military government of the occupied territories collected taxes from the Palestinians, like Israel collects taxes from its own population, but only some of these taxes were invested back into the Palestinian society, or the Palestinian economy, while some of that money was actually instead transferred to the Israeli Ministry of Finance. So that was the most direct colonial kind of theft that you could envision, but that's only one out of many ways by which the the occupation was profitable for Israel initially. But that started to change. And it started to change for two reasons. There are two kinds of costs of the occupation that we should look at. First of all is the civilian cost. The civilian cost is what Israel pays in order to encourage colonists to to colonize the West Bank, Jewish colonists. And that means benefits in housing, up to 50%, average, on average, 50% of the cost of a house in the occupied territories is subsidized by the government. For Jews only, of course. Subsidized transportation, special roads that are paved for the colonists, and colonists pay less taxes than other Israeli citizens. They receive more public buildings and therefore more public jobs as well, more jobs in the public sector, which create employment in the colonies. And all of these are summed up together to be quite large subsidies at about $3 billion annually in today's terms. And of course it changes by the rate by the number of colonists. $3 billion annually. But the bigger cost is actually the cost of security. And that's also the reason why the occupation ceased being profitable after about 20 years. Because after about 20 years of occupation, the first Intifada started. And when the Palestinians started to organize their rebellion against Israeli occupation, the Israeli government had to increase the number of soldiers stationed in the occupied territories by a factor of 10. And all the soldiers had to be equipped with special armor and better equipment, better guns and so on. Fences were erected around the colonies. Security cameras were set up everywhere. And that's the cost of security. Of course, the wall of separation, which is the most visible aspect of security in the occupied territories, is a very expensive project. And so far it costs about almost $5 billion, just the wall of separation. So the cost of, and the biggest part of the cost of security, more than everything that I've just said, put together, is the cost of internal security. Is the cost of having security guards stationed inside Israel. At the entrance to every shop, at every supermarket, every coffee shop, you see armed guards. On buses, you see armed guards. And prisons for housing approximately 11,000 Palestinian political prisoners at any given time. These prisons cost a lot of money. So all of these investments, expenditures, all of these expenditures amount to $6 billion annually in today's terms. Again, so altogether, 3 for civilian, 6 for military. You get a cost of occupation if you just, and this is of course an estimate that is just based on my calculations. You can disagree and you can challenge these calculations. Is $9 billion altogether every year, and that comprises about 9% of the total budget of the Israeli government. And the rate of growth of the settlement population, the colonist population in the occupied territories, is about 7% every year. 7% is almost biologically impossible for human beings to reproduce. It's not because of natural growth, like some of the colonists try to argue. It's because of immigration. And so many people immigrate into these colonies because of all the subsidies. And then the government spends more money on these subsidies. So it's a kind of snowball. And because of that snowball, the cost of occupation increases by approximately 7% every year, while the total Israeli budget grows by about 2.5% every year. By that calculation, we can imagine a future in which 50% of the Israeli budget would just be to maintain the occupation by the year 2038. That's not going to happen. That's not a realistic scenario, because something is going to happen in the middle. And we can argue that actually something is already happening, because the real cost of occupation is not measured in money, it's measured in the occupation's effect on Israel's society. The increasing social gaps, the increasing poverty, the neglect of public services. And that, of course, leads to the question, so in that case, why does Israel continue to occupy the Palestinian population? And the answer is quite complex. It has a lot to do with the fact that the Israeli political system is paralyzed, that no political party has the courage to go up and say, well, it seems that we've lost this round, and the most rational thing to do is to end the occupation. There is no real historical precedent of a colonial power just coming to a realization, oh, we've been wrong, sorry, and withdrawing. It always has to follow a very long struggle where the colonists try to cling on to the assets. And in many ways, what the Israeli society did was to take the colonists and turn them into scapegoats. The colonists are blamed for Israel's right-wing policies and for why Israel seems to act so irrationally and take over additional land that there's no way to manage and control effectively. But the colonists would never have been able to do that without a lot of support from the general society and from the government and a lot of budgets. And when Netanyahu goes to around the world to speak and he's challenged, why aren't you withdrawing from the occupied territories? His scapegoat is always, well, there are these crazy colonists and my government will collapse if I try to withdraw them. So that makes it easier for him to deflect international criticism. But then, of course, that creates an incentive for him, not just for him, for any prime minister, to keep supporting the colonists and increasing their number. And that creates, again, a kind of lock. But it's not just the colonists. It's every aspect of Israeli society. Now, BRICUP are one of the hosts of this, one of the organizations hosting this event, and they asked me to say something about the role of the Israeli academia in the occupation. So I'll just talk about that as one example out of many on how the occupation seeps into every aspect of Israeli life. Because all Israeli universities have professors who are former soldiers and officers. And as such, they have been trained by the army to see Palestinians as enemies and to see violence as a kind of solution that they can apply. These professors have turned the universities into institutions that are part of the mechanisms of the occupation. And they discriminate against Palestinian students. They discriminate against Palestinian staff. There are almost no Palestinian staff members in Israeli institutions. They give special benefits and special rewards for students that are soldiers, especially if they participate in particularly important, so to speak, clashes, like, for example, the invasion of Gaza, 2008-2009, won a lot of scholarships to a lot of soldier students. These same universities are then involved in developing new weapons and technologies used by the Israeli army in these conflicts. For example, the invasion of Gaza utilized unmanned bulldozers. Unmanned bulldozers which are remote controlled to demolish buildings. Obviously, an unmanned bulldozer is unable to distinguish whether there are human beings in the building that it is currently demolishing. Which perhaps make it a bit easier for the operator not to have guilty feelings and nightmares afterwards. But this unmanned bulldozer was developed by the Technion, which is the Israeli Institute for Technology in Haifa. Just to, one out of many, many examples, unfortunately. So that means that even if there are a lot of professors in the Israeli universities that say, well, the occupation is not so beneficial to Israel. And there are a lot of economists who say Israel is losing a lot of money and could improve its economic situation by stopping the occupation. But when they start to think about the ramifications, what will happen the day after? Who is going to ask them for compensations? How are they going to restructure the departments? How are they going to answer to donors? What are they going to do with all the weapons that they've been developing? Then they become a bit hesitant, and then they're not so keen on leading the struggle against the occupation and trying to bring justice. I I think it's almost impossible to find Israeli citizens, or at least Jewish Israeli citizens, that don't have a lot of family connections. And I have to admit that I myself have a lot of family connections that are involved in the occupation one way or another, profiting from the occupation one way or another, having colonists as family members. It's part of every aspect of Israeli society, and therefore it should come as no surprise that Israeli society is not so keen on revolution, having its own revolution and ending the occupation voluntarily. The last question, I don't have a lot of time left, right? Yeah, the last question is about why Palestine is so important. I think if the title of today's event was the occupation of Tibet by China, we'd probably not have as many people in the audience. Not because Tibet is less important, or Tibet is less, or Tibetans are less human beings than Palestinians, obviously, but because Palestine is indeed a region that draws so much international attention and has so much importance. Jerusalem is the second city in the world with number of journalists after after Washington City. There are more journalists in Jerusalem than in any other city in the world, with the exception of Washington, D.C. And this is because of a lot of economic reasons, partially, by the way, because of the role of Great Britain in dividing Palestine. Great Britain divided all of its colonies in two in order to create a kind of divide and conquer policy in Cyprus, in India, Pakistan, and also Israel-Palestine.
Ireland, the first one.
Yeah, Ireland, of course. And I don't have to tell you about that, but one of the things that Great Britain did is build the oil refineries and keep the oil refinery technology in the one area in the Middle East that doesn't actually have oil, and that's Israel. So to keep it in the hands, the technology to refine oil in the hands of the Jewish population, which was seen by Great Britain as a bit more Western in their civilization and a bit closer to the language and to the culture of Britain, while in order to prevent the Arab countries from fully enjoying the benefits of the oil that they have. So that's one example, but the examples are many, and Israel is very effective in exploiting that. So in 1956, Israel joined the colonial war against Egypt alongside with Britain and France, following Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal. But when colonization was no longer in fashion, Israel presented itself as the frontier in the Cold War, the last bastion against the spread of communism in the Middle East. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Israel adopted its new PR position as the forefront in the war on terror, the war against Islam. And even Netanyahu even said that the attacks on September 11 were very good for Israeli PR. But more important than all of this is the fact that Palestine serves as a kind of symbol. It's a symbol for struggle for freedom all over the world. And therefore, when people fight for freedom in Palestine, in London, or in Berlin, or in any other city that I happen to go to and meet activists, I don't think they do it just because of their solidarity with the Palestinian people. But they do it also because it's part of their own struggle for freedom and civil liberties. Because Israel is one of the world's largest exporters, if not the largest, of homeland security technology that is infringing on the civil liberties of every one of us. And every time that Western governments, or not just Western governments, are finding new methods to control the population, take biometric information, keep databases on people in order to keep them under control, that is being legitimized partially by the fact that there is a country which is considered part of the West, part of the democratic world, called Israel, which is doing it much, much worse. And I think it comes as no surprise that the biggest supporters of Israel in Europe, and not just in Europe, are the right-wing parties. In Britain, it's the ADL, for example, but There are examples for this in every European country, with the exception of Germany, which is a special case. Okay, I think I will stop here. The last point I wanted to make was about what we can do and what kind of action we can take, but maybe I'll leave that to the question part. Thank you.
I think that was absolutely terrific, really, really interesting. Thank you so much. By the way, I'm not paid by Pluto Press, but I am just going to make a few points. When Shir made the very interesting discussion about what happens in Israeli universities, many of you will have read Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, but this book, Out of the Frame, which Robin has copies of at the back, is a very personal description of how he was squeezed out of the Israeli academic community. And he now lives, as many of you may know, and works in Exeter. But I think as a kind of human document, and the detail that he gives, he is after all an academic, of what happens to you when you take up these kind of positions is extremely worth reading, and a good sort of backup to what you've been saying. And as I'm on my book moment, I have to talk about this one, because unfortunately the person who wrote it is dead. So I can't do this kind of a meeting for him, although it would be my great pride and joy to do so. For anyone who doesn't know about Shafiq al-Hud, he was one of the most important early PLO leaders. And in these days, where the Palestinian leadership is often reviled, disrespected, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad, I think it's incredibly inspiring and important for anybody who really wants to understand what this 50 years has been like, is to read this book. So that's that one. And the third one is this edition of Race and Class, of which is produced by the Institute of Race Relations, and I'm on the board, so I'll quickly put in that disclaimer. It's entirely devoted to Palestine, and again, Robin has some issues of it at the back, and it's got different things that you won't read anywhere else. So having said all those things, I see there are some people standing. There's one chair right here, and I think there's another one there if you want to, and another one there if you want to come round. And then I think it's time for some questions, and if people have got points they want to make to Shiv. I can see the hands are going up already. Can I see just a kind of wee waving of hands? Okay, great. Can I ask you to keep your questions relatively short, because I think there are a lot of people who want to speak. So shall we first of all have, is it Sarah? Yes. The reason that I chose her is that because she's on the organising committee at King's Palestine Action, which is our host. So please, Sarah.
Thank you, but I'm like, there's quite a lot of us around that are.
You better stand up so that people can hear you. The acoustics aren't brilliant in here.
I just wanted to ask, I'm not really good at economy and stuff, but what do you, I understood what you were saying, but just what do you make of what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, like with Egypt and Bahrain and all of that, and how, do you have any insight on what Israel is thinking of economically, or, how will it act if, things like the Gaza borders start open, or something happens with the Suez Canal, or maybe on the other borders as well? If you could just, it's not really a question, but it's just tell us a bit about that in the way that kind of...
I'll take 3 questions.
Okay, yeah.
I think we'll take 3 questions together. Thank you for that. And then Shir can answer. Mike.
Sorry, first one quick comment. When you were talking about American aid, you missed out an important part, which is there's much private assistance going from America to Israel, and much of that is tax deductible, so there is a government subsidy to all the private assistance that is going from America to Israel, and also to a lower key from the UK. Just to add that to your pictures.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether you could comment on the current attack on critical voices in Israel, both the attack on NGOs like the AIC that's gone through the Knesset, and the latest legislation going through the Knesset against academics and other people supporting boycott.
Thanks. Great questions. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could comment on the increasing use of private military companies at checkpoints, kind of the privatization of the occupations and the effects that might have.
Okay, thanks very much. I think that's the three great questions. If you can.
Yeah, I would like the opportunity to talk for 1 hour on each. I'll try to avoid doing that though. First of all, I'll answer by the order that they were asked. What's happening now in the Middle East and in Egypt is, of course, very concerning to the Israeli leadership, because they were very cozy in a kind of U.S. division of the Middle East into moderate regimes and radical enemies, where obviously moderate means they buy weapons from the U.S. and receive aid from the U.S., and the enemies mean that they don't, even though it not necessarily refers to how these regimes treat their own population. But the thing that obviously we have to bear in mind is that whenever there is a kind of awakening of anti-imperialism in the Middle East, Israel is partially a tool used to crush that. And the nationalization of the Suez Canal is obviously a prime example, but also in 2006, when there was a small democratic revolution in Lebanon, that was immediately followed by an Israeli invasion. The chances of an Israeli invasion of Egypt are smaller, because Egypt is a much stronger army than Lebanon, but we should still keep our eyes open. But regarding specifically the issue of Gaza and the siege on Gaza, the siege on Gaza is kind of something that got out of hand for the Israeli government, because when Israel is putting a limit on the number of aid trucks going into Gaza, they're actually losing money. They're taking about $1,000 from every truck for the right to pass to Gaza. So if they limit the number of trucks from 400 a day to 200 a day, which they do, then $200,000 a day are lost to them. But still the main source of income in Gaza is foreign aid, which is converted into Israeli currency, and Gaza is almost completely dominated by Israeli currency, which is something that was also revealed recently by WikiLeaks. And if Egypt decides unilaterally to open the border with Gaza and allow free trade, that could lead to a serious breach in Israel's whole custom envelope. And then I think what Israel might do in that case is further disconnect the West Bank from Gaza and increase the siege from the Israeli side, or at least the block from the Israeli side. That's not a very optimistic scenario, because the ties between Gaza and the West Bank are incredibly important for any kind of future solution that we can imagine. Otherwise, we'll have a three-state solution or something completely crazy. Mike, you mentioned the private donations, and I completely agree with you that unfortunately the private donations are often given directly to institutions within Israel, such as the colonies, and they are not reported. So you may be right, there are different estimates, but they are very, very wildly divergent, because there is just no data. If you have anything, I'll be very happy to put it in my next book. And your question about attack on critical voices, I don't know, there's this phrase that it always gets dark before dawn, the darkest before dawn. What we see now with the Israeli government is a level of desperation that we've never seen before. And we can see that. I'm not necessarily saying that this is an optimistic thing. It could be optimistic if we take this opportunity and we take action now and increase the pressure and force Israel to become accountable for its actions. But it could also lead to further disaster. And now the feeling in Israel is that the international community is fed up. Or, maybe not the governments. The governments are still supporting Israel quite happily, but the population is not. And no Israeli today is oblivious to the boycott campaign. No, every Israeli knows that there is a boycott campaign. Every Israeli knows that things are happening. And because of that, the government is now trying to take more and more severe actions in limiting civil liberties. To be honest, they've always limited the civil liberties of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and of course Palestinians in the occupied territories. But now when it comes also to left-thinking Jews, the cry out is heard strongly in the world, because these people have access to academia and to newspapers, the media, so on. So we hear about it more. But the most recent laws are a new investigative committee which is set up to find out the funding sources of leftist organizations, and only leftist organizations. The committee is staffed by the most extreme right parliament members in Israel, and the Alternative Information Center is on the list of organizations to be investigated, even though, according to Israeli law, every such organization has to report its donors anyway. There's really nothing more to find out. But the committee is, of course, used as a tool for delegitimization, for exposing these organizations and mobilizing public rage against them. And the second law is the law to criminalize calls for boycott. Boycott in Israel is legal. For example, religious people in Israel would boycott any non-kosher restaurant, and nobody makes laws against that. But calling for a boycott on Israel, supporting a boycott on Israel, signing your name to a petition supporting the boycott on Israel will become a crime, punishable by 30,000 shekels, which is approximately 5,000 pounds, without a trial and without the need to prove that damage has been inflicted. So that means that, and of course that also includes a boycott on produce from the colonies. That means that if for example, an organization publishes a map which shows which products are produced in the colonies and which are not. This map is considered to be material which supports the boycott. Therefore, this organization could be charged with 5,000 pounds for every time they make that call. I guess that for someone like me, that would mean fines of in the millions for every time that I called for boycott or supported the boycott. So far, this law has not yet passed, and even if it passes, it might be shut down by the High Court. But I think the fact that it is promoted and is very popular in the Israeli parliament is an interesting indication to the feeling that in the Israeli government as if they are being besieged. But of course, they're not being besieged by the left movements inside Israel. The left movements inside Israel are a tiny, tiny minority. Less than 1% of the population is belongs to what is known as the radical left. Radical left means supporting the rights of Palestinians. But of course, since the Israeli government cannot put fines on every international activist in the world that supports boycott, they target their anger at whoever is closest. The last question is about the privatization of security in Israel. That's a very fascinating topic, I think, and I do talk about it a little bit in the book. The conscription rates to the Israeli army are dropping, which seems to be contrary to this idea that Israeli society is so closed, it becomes even more closed and more right-wing and more extreme. But people may have these opinions. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're willing to sacrifice for these opinions and go to the army. And many young Israelis find ways to avoid military service, not necessarily for political reasons. and there are less and less soldiers, and yet Israel continues to create new enemies for itself and to engage in conflict. So there's a shortage. And one of the ways by which Israel is dealing with this shortage in person power is to privatize all of the checkpoints. And they have. All the permanent checkpoints have been privatized and are now run by private security companies. Those of you who've seen it, may think that these are soldiers, but if you look closely, you see soldiers that actually wear a little piece of yellow cloth or blue cloth, which indicates which private company they're actually working for. And that's a way to save on person power, but it also makes the occupation more expensive, because regular soldiers in Israel are actually slave labor. They don't receive salaries, and the private security guards do receive salaries. And this privatization is also contributing to Israel's leading role as an exporter, because these private companies then can have a branch which exports the same methods, technologies, and training to other countries in the world. For example, to Brazil, which is now preparing for the World Cup event by trying to suppress the favelas using Israeli technology.
Great, thank you very much. Oh, a forest. Actually, before I completely take the forest, I think that as we've got on to boycotts, I should ask the chair of BRICUP just to make a quick, because I think there are many people here who don't know what BRICUP is. So, Jonathan, do you want to just, rather briefly, because there really are a lot of questions. This is Jonathan Rosenhead.
Hi, I've been told I've got 3 minutes, so I slashed through a lot of what I wanted to say. BRICUP stands for the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, sponsored this meeting, and has been probably the leading body concerned with academic boycott anywhere. We've been lucky that Israel continues to commit outrages, so now there are comparable bodies in other countries in Europe, and we even have a European-wide body called the European Platform for Academic Boycott. So this is all developments thanks to Israel. What I should say is, since I'm not going to have time to say it, is that I have here in my hand a pamphlet which is normally priced at £2.50, and there are copies at the back for 50p. Now, this is the maximum discount we've ever given. And it will tell you, it's entitled Why Boycott Israeli Universities, and it will tell you all the things that I don't have time to say. What I'd like to say is that we've also, of course, been involved as BRICUP with the cultural boycott. And we're not the only body that's working there, although we are predominant in the academic boycott. In the cultural boycott, we've been the authors of a series of incandescent letters which have gone out and gone around the world and persuaded people like Gil Scott Heron to not to go to Israel, and some others too. Thomas Kwastoff has just not gone, and he was a victim of one of these letters, although he says it's flu. Some other people like Leonard Cohen and Margaret Atwood went despite our letters, but nevertheless, there's a big effect of these letters in educating people about Israel, and indeed the controversy about Margaret Atwood, curiously enough, has provoked the formation of a chapter of the cultural and academic boycott in India, because she was winning a prize jointly with an Indian writer. So there are lots of benefits, even when we don't actually win that particular chapter, and we see in the cultural field the number of people who decided that they're not going to go, sometimes announcing that they're not going to go because of politics, and sometimes finding it better just not to go and keeping quiet about it are enormous. But we've had Vanessa Paradis, who didn't go along with Johnny Depp, her husband, also didn't go. Mike Lee, filmmaker, Elvis Costello, and so on. So I miss out a whole lot of that. Israel is, although formidable in economic and military strength, is hysterical, verging on desperation, as Shir has said, about the boycott. They see it as, they call it delegitimization, they see it as an attack upon the right of Israel to exist. And in a sense, it is. It's an attack on Israel as it is, certainly, with war crimes and occupation continuing in that way. And what I call it is the counterattack of world civil society, dragging reluctant governments to transform the political landscape. The Israelis regard the United Kingdom, and I suppose London in particular, but the United Kingdom in general, as the centre of this whole activity worldwide. There was a recent report, was it the Reut Institute? They called it something, Reut, sorry. They called it something, I can't remember, something like the Viper's Nest, but anyhow, the worst place for their enemies. and I hope and believe it will continue to be so. I'd just like to raise a few points of the campaigns that are coming up shortly. It won't be time to give you the full details, but you should look out for them. For example, I'll just take the field of classical music. In the latter part of March, there's the ALAC Chamber Music Festival, supported, interestingly enough, by the Zionist Federation of Great Britain. And the Gabrielli Consort, which is based here, will go there unless we persuade them not to. In May, there's the Israel Festival, located in Jerusalem, and Florilegium, a very noted group, will similarly go there unless we persuade them not to, and these should all be targets of cultural boycott. I could go on to great length, but closer to home, at the end of March, we have at SOAS a conference on the art and music of Israel, supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel, the Ministry of Culture and Sport in Israel, and the London Embassy. And we are going to be, since they're coming to us, we're going to make that a real focus of attention. I hope you will join in with the activities that follow from that. I could go on with the academic boycott, but I will just end now just to say that there's a lot of scope for the campus-based activity for those of us who are students or staff. Our colleagues are in many cases engaged with Israeli universities who are complicit in the occupation and all the other things that Israel does. And if you research it on campus, you'll find things you can campaign about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as you're talking about things on campus, I'm just going to tell you about, again, in March, the 18th, 19th and 20th, Palestinians from this group here will join with people in SOAS, and there's going to be a 3-day event, which is photographic exhibitions, films, food, discussions, and maybe it's just exactly the same time as that other thing is going to happen, or just before. Anyway, please remember the date, 18, 19, 20th, and it's certainly on the SOAS website, and I'm sure it's here in King's too. So can I see some more hands? Oh, wow. Yes, it's rather overwhelming. Let me take the 3 along the side there, starting at the back. And then the lady, and then the man in the blue shirt.
Yes, you said that 9/11 was very good for Israel. It was also, of course, very good for the United States. I mean, the Patriot Act was printed before 9/11. And I'd just like to ask why you think there is such a taboo in left-wing and progressive circles and in the press about bringing up whether or not 9/11 was an inside job. And I'd just like to add that Lyndon Johnson in 1967 tried another false flag operation in conjunction with Israel, and that was the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, which it was going to be blamed on Egypt, false flag, and the United States was going to nuke Egypt. I do have some leaflets out there, and I'll be giving them out to anyone who wants them as I go first. But the main thing, the question is, why is there this taboo about bringing up whether or not, and allowing a free debate about whether 9/11 was an inside job, because it's so relevant to the war, so-called war on terror? And
I'm just going to make a chair's ruling that we're not going to have that discussion at this point, because I know what will happen. It's happened to me too many times. So the lady in the glasses.
Yes, the demographics of Israel, the Jewish population, have changed a lot since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Russian immigrants have become an increasingly powerful force. And I wondered what your view was of the extent to which their contribution to the political scene is behind this blind spot about the costs of occupation.
I want to ask you about the tunnel economy into Gaza. It's obviously very important to Gaza, and I've always been curious as to why Israel hasn't tried to stop it very seriously. You would have thought if they really wanted to, they could bomb the hell out of all those tunnel entrances, or they could get Egypt to stop it, and yet they don't. And I'm very curious as to why.
Okay, I'll take a third.
Yes, you talked about the academics, but also the role of the professionals in the occupation. And I particularly, we got an organization called Architects and Planners for Justice in Palestine, which is challenging Israeli architects actually building the occupation and trying to get the Israeli professionals to to actually recognize that what they're doing is illegal and it's actually being condemned by the International Union of Architects, but were scared to actually take the step. We're trying to get them, thrown out of the union, but there's such pressure as this considered as a political act, and we're saying it's a professional and ethical one. But the same thing is with the medicals, the Medical Association on torture. But if you could just say something briefly on the role of architects and planners, actually involved even in things like El Araqib, the new blueprint native, which is going to go over unrecognized villages.
Okay. Well, to the first gentleman who asked the question about 9/11, I'm
No,
afraid
we're not doing that.
It's not my field of expertise, and I really cannot answer you on that. Sorry. I'll try to answer the other questions to the best of my ability. First of all, the immigration from the former Soviet Union. We're talking about approximately 1 million people that came, but most of them have already left, because this was a period of very high very deep crisis in the Soviet Union, in Russia. Yeltsin's authoritarian regime at the time was not a very pleasant place to live, and a lot of these people had an option to remember their Jewishness or find a Jewish relative and therefore have a ticket to Israel. But after a while, many of them decided they don't like Israel so much and they moved on to more developed countries, or they went back to Russia. So that has not been such a huge demographic change as it may seem from the start. I think it's interesting that amongst the most extremist right-wingers in Israel, you find immigrants like Lieberman, I think the famous figure. In a way, you can say that for people like him, they maybe need to prove that they're really loyal to Israel, that they're really part of Israeli society, and they do that by taking the most right-wing nationalist position that they can find, and then going a little bit to the right from that. But there are also a lot of immigrants who are in the left, and the opinions vary. I don't think that this particular immigration changed Israeli society or political sphere. Because the immigrants became involved in almost every project in Israel, also in the colonies, in the academy, and so on. That's my opinion, but I haven't done an intensive research of that. Regarding the tunnel economy, what happens specifically in the tunnel economy is that there are three actors playing there. There's the Egyptian army, there's the Israeli army, and there's the US. And the Egyptian army was taking a position, which I'm hoping will change, to try to prevent this trade as much as possible. The Israeli army was acting in a kind of adventuristic way of retaliation whenever the government wanted to boost public support. But they didn't really have a strategy. But when you have the U.S. Inspectors in Rafah, in the Egyptian side of Rafah, monitoring the tunnels and completely aware of the role that the tunnels play, the Americans said very clearly, if these tunnels will be shut down, the humanitarian result in Gaza would be catastrophic. It would be poverty. Poverty already exists. It would be famine, mass famine in Gaza, because the tunnels are extremely crucial to importing some life-saving items that are not allowed by Israel through the siege. So because the US is there and they are trying to actually allow these tunnels to operate, in order to maintain a kind of status quo in which Israel can maintain the siege, and avoid an explosion of a humanitarian catastrophe, Israel didn't challenge the U.S. position on that point. So just because the tunnels were so vital to the Palestinian economy. And that's the real reason. One could also make the argument that maybe Israel wanted Hamas to be able to import some ammunition to justify attacking Gaza. I don't know if that's true or not. At least there is no evidence of that. But it seems that Israel has made it very clear that they're not interested in any discussion of proportionality. So in that case, it doesn't really matter how much ammunition Hamas has. They said it very clearly in 2006. A very senior Israeli officer said that they are going to adopt the Doha doctrine. The Doha doctrine, Dahya doctrine. The Dahya doctrine means that whenever the Israeli army is called upon to retaliate to any kind of violence or perceived violence, the reaction would be complete and utter destruction, regardless of how much firepower was directed at Israel. And when that is the doctrine and that's well known and no attempt is made to hide it, then why would they need Hamas to actually have access to real ammunition?
Can you spell that? Sorry, Dahya.
Dahya? Well, I wouldn't know what's the proper English spelling for it, but it's Dakhia. Yeah, it's a name of a village in Lebanon which Israel wiped from the map, basically, and that was to serve as an example in 2006.
Okay, some more hands?
Oh, I didn't answer the question about professionals. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Forgive me.
Well, I just want to stress one point about the issue with professionals. I think it's very important not to boycott individuals. But I'm sure you don't. But it needs to be said openly that the idea is not to say to an Israeli architect who may have graduated from an Israeli university and has done some work in Israel in architecture, because you're Israeli, because your university, you studied at a racist university, because you've been part of the apartheid regime, you're not going to be able to find work in Europe. That's not what the Palestinian call for boycott is. The Palestinian call for boycott is specifically on institutions.
That's
so
exactly who we are targeting.
Yeah. So, for example, the Israeli Union of Doctors that you mentioned, the Medical Association, they condone the actions of medical doctors who conceal files about torture or not report evidence that they see of torture of prisoners in their medical reports. And because of that, this organization is not legitimate and should be boycotted. But that was the only point I wanted to make about that.
What's most interesting is that one of the members of BENCOM, an architect, who was a member, which is an association that defends Palestinians, is now actually building or planning the IDF new headquarters on Mount Scopus, the same architect, Eli Elam. So, I mean, we actually raised the issue of individual names, but target the institute.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, the person at the back.
Me?
Yes.
I'd just like to ask you about the likelihood that if there were to be any reduction in the occupation, that all the resources that are going into that would be transferred into the Judaization of the Galilee and the Negev and other Zionist projects, and the reduction in it suggests that the reduction in occupation without actually addressing the central project of Zionism is problematic. And can I just ask you, as an addendum to that, the fact that the left-right spectrum in Israel was defined in terms of the occupation and peace and so on, if you could comment on the ramifications of this for any serious debate on political economy in Israel.
Aside from all the aid that Israel receives from the West, how would you characterize the rest of the economic relationship? Is it just a trading relationship, or is there a very strong integration between Israel and any other Western country, similar to, let's say, the integration between the Netherlands and Germany, or South Korea and Japan? And then, subsidiary to that, how much, in the economic relations, how much political autonomy would you say that Israel has from Western powers?
Yeah. You had a question.
Yes, I wondered whether you had factored in the issue of theft, the main things being land and water, and the big pool of gas and oil that's sitting outside Gaza's waters, or in Gaza's waters. And I mean, in relation to land especially, where you're talking about the settlements as a drain on the economy, but there's a hell of a lot of real estate being sold abroad in beautiful places on land which has been stolen and which has come free. So I don't know whether you factored that in at all. I've got a much, much bigger question, which I don't know if it would be able to deal with, but your entire sort of framework is the occupation and all that. Supposing you just took all the borders away as one status say, would that be kind of easier for them to face up to doing psychologically, quite apart from the whole Jewish state thing, but economically and in terms of their arrangements, would that be, kind of impossible to contemplate, or would that be a freeing up from all these rather dodgy deals, which may be bringing you a lot of money, but are quite brittle and fragile in their way? So that's, I don't know if you can take that other one on board, but it does appeal to me.
Well, actually the first question relates very much to what you're saying, because you were asking about what happens if the occupation ends, what will happen with these resources, would they be used to deepen apartheid within Israel? I think that one of the troubles that I have with talking about the occupation and defining the term occupation that I started with this evening is that perhaps the term is gradually becoming obsolete. Because the borders have been eroded by Israel for so many years that in many ways it seems almost impossible to imagine how the land can be divided into two states. I think it is possible, and I think that the decision whether to divide it into two states or leave it as one state but a democratic state is a decision to be taken by the Palestinians. It's their struggle, and they are going to decide. My opinion, my preference is obviously one democratic state for everyone, and I don't. And I also think that would be the best way to promote a recovery process from the damage of the occupation, from the total destruction that was created, and how to rebuild prosperity in the region would be much easier in under a unified framework than two separate entities. But because of that, I think that without seriously changing the political nature of Israel, the essential politics of Israel, which is a politics of displacement, the Zionist idea that a Jewish state means a state where Jews are superior to everyone else. If this idea is not rooted out, not the idea rooted out, but defeated in politics and replaced by a democratic idea, I'm sure there will still be Zionists afterwards, then if that will not happen, then there will be no end to the occupation and no one-state solution, or no solution at all. So I don't see a scenario in which Israel withdraws from the occupied territories but maintains its ethnic cleansing policies within Israel. That's my opinion. As for the discussion on political economy within Israel, that's a little bit of a sensitive topic for me, because when I was trying to find a university to study in and to do my PhD in, I found that a lot of economists in Israel are quite willing to say that they oppose the occupation. Some of them are active in very radical leftist groups, and are considered leftist in Israel. But when it comes to their economic opinions, they would be classified very right-wing by international standards. And you can also see the opposite. You can also see people who have ideas of socialism, but socialism only for Jews. And that creates a kind of distortion in the Israeli left versus right definition as compared to most countries in the world. And it does harm the level of the debate. Indeed, there are only a very few professors in the Israeli academia who are able to talk about political economy, really, without, as what it should be, as a kind of connecting field between different disciplines. Now, your question about Israel's role with the West and the trade relations. Israel is one of the most globalized economies in the world, and it is highly dependent on imports and exports. Its main trading partner is Europe, the biggest trading partner by far, and as such, Israel is also very sensitive to the boycott campaign, unlike, for example, South Africa. South Africa was able to endure boycott for decades because they relied on local raw materials, on the local workforce, and they didn't rely so much on trade. Israel does not have that luxury. Israel will not be able to sustain decades of boycott. And I think that's a positive thing, because we want Israel to feel the effect of boycott as fast as possible, because we want a solution in our lifetime. And about your question on political autonomy of the Israeli government, I think if you look at it in terms of what are the external pressure on the Israeli government, you would see that the external pressures are quite limited. Europe rarely allows itself to interfere in Israeli politics, except for some very weak statements. And the United States has a kind of position that whatever Israel says is gospel, and the U.S. can never interfere with that. So there's very little that Israel can do that the U.S. will deny. But having said that, I think that the Israeli government doesn't have any autonomy because of internal reasons, because the Israeli government is acting in a very predictable pattern. And one can easily predict what the Israeli government is going to do next, because they are not proactive, they're completely reactive, they don't have any long-term strategy, they don't have any plan on how to deal with international pressure, how to deal with the demographic issues, or how to keep controlling the Palestinian population during its resistance. So in that sense, they are completely fixed into a very narrow path, which is predictable. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of strength. They have a lot of guns that they can use when following that path, but at least we know where they're heading. You asked me about the theft issue, and obviously when colonists steal water or land, they don't report it and they don't put it in the books. So when I try to look at the databases and the information, I cannot really find the full value of these things. But what can be done, and that's the work of some political economists, is to try to identify sources of growth of the Israeli economy that are involved in the exploitation of the Palestinian economy. So that creates a kind of rough estimate of how all these different kinds of theft, where you bundle together also the exploitation of labor, for example, Palestinian workers pay taxes to Israel and pay social security taxes, but they don't receive the benefits. So that's also theft. And you bundle all of this together and see how it is reflected in accelerated growth of the Israeli economy. And there are various ways to do that. None of them are accurate. None of them give you a very clear picture, which makes it, of course, difficult, because you can't really use that result and say, okay, this is exactly how much land Israel stole or how much water Israel stole. That requires a very careful calculation. But what I was able to do, I did put in the calculation, and it did come up is approximately $38 billion worth of theft. Altogether, yeah.
Okay, I can see one at the very back, and then the man with the white hair there, and then you. I won't forget.
Sorry, I'm a Bible believer, so I believe that God has brought his people back. But I'm going to speak on humanity terms. The San Remo Convention of 1923 lawfully ratified the Balfour Agreement, giving all the land west of Jordan to the Jewish people. So that is just God, that is the law, and in international law, land gained in defence of external aggression is spoils of war. All 5 wars Israel has had have been in defence. So what I'm saying is how do you get to the point that you talk about occupied territory? It's disputed, fair enough, but it's not occupied. And that's all I have to say. I cannot believe you're banging against a wall.
I want to ask about the military-industrial complex. When you mentioned Iceland talk, and I wonder what we might think in terms of, because the military-industrial complex in Israel is leading to it being number 5, in some years even number 4 arms exporter in the world. This tiny country is in this very powerful position. And this is also part of the occupation benefits, because it is actually realizing the investment into terrorizing the Palestinian and other Arab countries into a series of products. I wonder if you could speak about that.
My question is actually connected a bit with the lady at the back, because surely one of the main reasons why the Palestinian cause is so popular as compared with Tibet or Chechnya is the traditional religious role of the land as the Holy Land to so much of the world, and there's an expectation of justice to be done in the Holy Land. So, I know that's very far away from economics.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for your comments, because I think it's much better if we have a discussion with more than one opinion. And I think also it's very important that you bring these things up, because maybe not everyone are quite clear on the facts. The fact that, for example, Great Britain promised the same land to different groups of people at the same time is well documented. But what is very important by the fact that you were mentioning Balfour, and thanks for bringing that up, is also connected to what you were saying about the role of Israel as in the eyes of religion. I think there are many interpretations for every religion, but Israel does play in Palestine a very important role for a certain interpretation of religion, especially Christian religion, in a way that is anti-Semitic. And Balfour is a very good example of that, because Balfour clearly saw, and Balfour was an anti-Semite, he saw the creation of a state for Jews in Palestine, not just as a path towards Christian redemption. It was a path towards cleaning Britain from its Jews, cleaning Europe from its Jews. And the Zionist movement had allies in its early days from amongst the anti-Semitic movements, and even in the early years of Nazi Germany. And these allies, which completely agreed with the Zionist principle, Jews should not be in Europe, they should go to Palestine. That it has to be clarified. This is anti-Semitism, and of course, I do not support it. And until today, a lot of the support that the colonists receive comes from certain Christian groups, especially in the United States, but not only, which believe in that the way to bring salvation is if Jews and Muslims will kill each other in the Holy Land, and that will bring a rupture and salvation. I personally don't believe that, but then they spend money to support right-wing organizations in Israel and colonies. This has been, and also some of the organizations that stand behind the current government of Israel. So these things have to be clarified. And of course, this is something that we always have to bear in mind when the Israeli Foreign Ministry likes to say that anyone who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite. But the Israeli Foreign Ministry is also the organization that promotes this idea that Jews cannot be safe in Europe, for example. And recently, a Dutch minister made a statement that was very pleasing to the ears of the Israeli foreign minister, that perhaps religious Jews should not live in the Netherlands anymore. This is exactly the kind of anti-Semitism which gave so much power to Zionism.
I hope you don't mind if I mention that in the British cabinet that agreed the declaration, there was only one dissident who did not want this declaration. He was the only Jewish member of the cabinet. That was Edwin Montague, and he opposed the Balfour Declaration because he thought it would lead to anti-Semitism, and his prediction is absolutely true, as you just mentioned.
But you made another very important point, and I also want to say something about that when you said that the occupied territories are actually contested territories because Israel took over them in defensive wars. Well, first of all, it should be just clarified that the territory that I talked about this evening, which is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem and the Golan Syrian Heights, were occupied in the war of 1967, which was a war initiated by Israel, not by other countries. And it was actually initiated by Israel as a response to the threat by the Egyptian government to close the Suez Canal to Israeli ships. But the problem was that only one Israeli ship actually went through the Suez Canal the previous year. When Egypt made that provocative statement, Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, told Israel that he wants to prevent a war in the Middle East, and he's willing to send American warships to escort any Israeli ship that wants to pass through the Suez Canal. And the Israeli government, pressured by two ministers, Yigal Allon and Yitzhak Rabin, decided to go to war anyway. Even though at one point the US threatened that they will send Marines to Egypt to defend Egypt against Israel, but the Israeli government never thought that this threat was credible, and they invaded anyway, and they occupied it. Also the Sinai Peninsula, which was eventually returned to Egypt in the peace agreement of 1978. So just these are the facts of the occupation, and then Israel actually acknowledged in 1967 that the Fourth Geneva Convention does apply to the occupied territories. And Israel did acknowledge that this territory is occupied. Only later it decided to change its position and to actually say, no, these are contested territory, they're not really occupied. So that's a very interesting development that happened within Israel, because right after the occupation, most Israelis believed that occupation is temporary, and Moshe Dayan, who was Minister of Defense, actually said that, well, he said before the war, if there's going to be war, we are going to occupy territory, and then we'll be able to give back the territory and have a peace agreement. That's what he said before the war. After the war, he was asked by journalists, well, you got the territory, are you going to start peace negotiations? And he said, well, I'm waiting for them to call me first. And that was that. Later it was revealed that actually there were some initiatives by Arab neighbors to start peace negotiations by Israel, but Israel pretended not to receive them. So these are just facts that are very important for everyone to know, I think, and thank you for bringing up this issue. Now, the military-industrial complex in Israel is a very big topic. I think I did refer to it a little bit in how Israel also becomes one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, exporter of homeland security products. That's a specialty of Israel within the military-industrial complex. And that is especially relevant for unmanned aircraft, which are used also by Britain in Afghanistan, for example. And this industry altogether comprises 12.3% of the Israeli GDP. GDP, gross domestic product. Apologies for the economic term. But just to put it in comparison, the United States, one of the most militarized economies in the world, 4.5% of GDP goes to military. Most European countries, 1% and 2%. In Israel is 12.3% higher than any country in the world, with the exception of possibly Eritrea. The data is not very accurate, so I cannot be completely definitive about that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I don't have more to add, I'm afraid, about the issue of the Holy Land. Sorry.
Okay, I think we'll take the last group of questions. You were the first. Then there are two gentlemen at the back.
Here.
Is there anyone like you intervene for that? Because then it is the situation. That means the Palestinian lower level of the animals because the situation. Just really lower level of and what is the role of the president of Obama?
And then the two at the back.
We couldn't hear any of that.
You'll get it resumed when he answers. It was about human rights, basically.
This isn't actually a question, but a correction. I'm sorry, but you mentioned El Araki at the beginning, said it had been destroyed 11 times, but on the AIC site today, it mentions the 18th and ongoing destruction of El Araki.
What number?
Well, it's basically the last 5 days has been under siege. The villagers have been locked up in the cemetery and are being besieged, and the land is being flattened by the JNS. So.
Was it 18?
There was another man almost. Yes, it was you. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. On a point of information about Balfour. Balfour was a Scottish Orangeman, and before he advocated the partition of Palestine, he advocated the partition of Ireland, and he also advocated the setting up of a Protestant state in Ireland, and the Protestant state that he advocated setting up in Ireland was similar to the racist states in the South, in Southern America, and the racist Orange state in South Africa. That's just a point of information.
At least it was consistent.
Because the Balfour Declaration did not grant a Jewish state in the Middle East. It said that they favoured a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and that could have meant a non-racist, unified country. Balfour was not committed to a Zionist state.
Yeah, Thank you for the clarification.
The phrase notwithstanding the rights of the local inhabitants, there was that clause. And that clause was a safety clause put in by one of the Jewish members of the government in order to safeguard, as he thought, the rights of Palestinians at that time. Because this particular person was not, did not like the idea of the Zionists having the whole thing. So just a point of information, there were Jewish people who were opposed to the declaration, and higher people put that clause in to try and safeguard Palestinian rights. The question is, Israel gave up the Sinai and kicked out the settlers, about 6,000 of them. They gave up, okay, they sieged it, how they did give up the Gaza Strip and chuck out the settlers. I'm just wondering whether you think, if they've done those two things, whether they'd be able to, or would do in the future, the same thing, that they eventually they tire of all this and they say, right, we scrap this and we'll kick out the settlers. I'm wondering whether the sort of previous things that they've done, which they said they would never do, and they did, and they're saying now they never do, whether you think maybe in the future they will.
Okay.
Sorry, there's one last question
right.
here. Excuse me.
Well, sorry, I was going to make more of a statement, if you don't mind, just about PSC. I'm on the executive PSC, and we're, as you know, one of the co-organisers of the meeting. I'll be really, really brief, but we are a solidarity movement, as you might guess from the name, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And we do work with groups in Palestine and Israel and in this country to try and get a just solution to the situation there. Really, our aim is to increase pressure to end the occupation, and so we will do anything legally, decently, honestly, and truthfully that we can to pursue that end. And just some of the strategies and actions that we take part in, as you may know if you're already a member of PSC, are things like meetings like this, fundraising, fact-finding trips where we take people over to the occupied territories and to Israel to see what the situation's like. We help organise and fund demos and lobbies. We're widely involved in the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Campaign, the Gaza flotilla and convoys and so on, the EU trade agreement that trying to stop the Israeli arms agreements and so on. We are having some victories. We've heard about them, so I won't go over those because other people have made enough of those. And just to refer briefly to the document, which identified PSC as one of the key organisations in the hub, what they call the hub, of delegitimisation of Israel. And we see that as actually that our work and the work of all the people that we work with is having an impact, as Shir has kind of indicated. I mean, I think part of this discussion tonight has been about what is legitimate and what is democracy, and I think there's a big discussion to be had there. But obviously, what's happening with the Knesset is not what I see as a way of democratically behaving, and the way that the Israeli Arabs are treated. And I just particularly want to draw your attention to the situation of children, Palestinian children, who are being tortured and detained routinely in complete contravention of international law and decency by anyone's standard, and to encourage you to find out more about that through Defence of the Child International Palestine. As a member of the PSC, really what I want to say finally is I really would encourage you to join. If you're not a member, you may be a sympathiser, you may go to the demo, but actually we need money, and we need money to fund this kind of thing, the kind of publications that give out the truth of what is happening and so on. So if you're not a member, please join. If you're a member of a group or a union group, please join. The TUC is now part of the campaign. That's 6 million workers in this country who are agreed to fight and campaign for the rights of the Palestinian people. So we are having some success. We really are, but we actually do need now to make it an absolutely mass campaign. So please, if you're not a member, join.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going just to conclude by answering the final questions and making a small statement. So with your permission, I'm going to lay to rest the discussion about the Balfour Declaration, because as fascinating as it is, it's still a bit of a historical topic, and I'd rather focus on the more current events. And thanks for the information about El Araqib. I wasn't aware of it, so that's important. Okay, so your question was about why does development aid fail? And instead of giving you a whole lecture about that, let me just give you one example which has almost all of the components of how Israel prevents development aid from succeeding. And the example is the port in the Gaza Strip that was donated by the Dutch government. Cost $200 million. Also, the French government put $50 million. And Israel stopped all the raw materials at the ports and kept it there for months, so that they had to pay storage fees out of their budget, until it was finally released, put on Israeli trucks, then stopped again at the checkpoints for weeks, where they had to pay storage fees for weeks, and the salary of the transportation companies, the truck drivers. The workers who were supposed to build it were stopped at the checkpoint. They sat in their car all day. They got their salary, but they didn't do any work. By the time the $200 million were finished, only the foundations of the port were built. And then Israeli airplanes flew over and bombed them. So that is a good example of how development aid fails. And the Dutch government to this day never asked for its money back, never asked for explanations why Israel destroyed the port. You also asked me about the role of Obama. I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but despite some small statements about peace, Obama seemed to continue directly the policies of Bush and to continue to support aid to Israel, to continue to, just now the United States is vetoing a UN decision to condemn the colonies. So while it's officially part of the US policy not to support the Israeli colonization of the West Bank, the US is still defending Israel in the UN and vetoing a condemnation. So that's about Obama, unfortunately. The question about evacuation of colonists. When the colonists from Sinai were evacuated, they were giving huge compensations. And when the colonists from Gaza were evacuated, 8,000, during that very same year, the number of settlers, colonists in the West Bank was increased by 20,000. So the total number of colonists increased by 12,000, while Israel pretended to withdraw from Gaza. And on average, every family of colonists from Gaza that was evacuated received €1 million on average. That was the average compensation. And the reason for such high compensation was not just because these colonists were very good lobbyists, but also in order to make to create a precedent that will prevent future withdrawals. Currently, there are 500,000 colonists in the West Bank. 500,000. If each family would receive €1 million, we're talking about €500 billion. And €500 billion is almost 2 years of Israeli budget, government budget. It's more than any amount of money that Israel might possibly get from the international community in exchange for withdrawing the colonists. So no, it's not practical. Therefore, this precedent cannot happen again. Something else might happen, like what happened in Algeria, for example, a mass exodus of colonists that were not properly compensated. In the case of France, that led to some social problems. In the case of Israel, it would lead to 100-fold social problems because one in every 14 Israeli citizen is a colonist. So it's a very big part of the population. What I want to conclude with is get back to what Jonathan said before about the cultural boycott. Although perhaps we mentioned already some successes, I think one comes to mind, especially from last week, when an Israeli radio show decided to take one song from every performer that canceled their show in Israel for political reasons, just one song, and they made a show of 1 hour. And they said, well, this is the first time in history that we can compose a whole hour of radio show just from the songs of performers that canceled. And this was a show that was not leftist. It was actually full of profanities directed at these performers. Why do they boycott us? And but it means that everyone is aware of it. It means that the cultural boycott has an effect, that Israelis realize that something is changing. In a recent poll, most Israelis said they don't believe Israel is going to exist in 50 years. So the fact that change is coming, I think, is widely accepted. And it's really up to us, obviously up to Palestinians, up to Israelis, but up to everyone, really, to decide what kind of change we're going to see. And that's why I think we should really consider what kind of action we can take now when the timing is so critical. So thank you very much for coming tonight.
I want to thank Shir for one of the most interesting and new presentations of all this incredibly complicated material. It was so excellent. Thank you very, very much for making the effort. Thank you all for coming. But all the questions that were asked The answers are in this book.
Not
almost all. Oh no, not all, quite, sorry. And it is currently discounted at the back. If you go and get it today, it's a bargain. And I hope lots of you will. And anybody who wants the Shafiq book, if you ask Robin, he will get it for you. So thank you all very much, and good night. Very rare to do such a